Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, his eyes heavy with the weight of another sleepless night. At 28, he felt like a ghost haunting his own life. The promotion he'd been promised went to someone else. Again. His girlfriend Sarah had left him 3 months ago, citing his lack of ambition and negative energy. Even his own mother had stopped asking about his career during their weekly calls. "You're pathetic," he whispered to his reflection, the words cutting deeper than any criticism from others ever could. The mirror didn't lie. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his shoulders slumped forward in defeat, and his once bright smile had faded into a permanent grimace of resignation. He was living in a prison of his own making, trapped by limiting beliefs that whispered poison into his mind every waking moment. "You're not good enough. You'll never amount to anything. Why even try?" But that morning was different. Something had shifted during the sleepless hours of the night before. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was the final straw breaking under the weight of his dissatisfaction. As he stood there, confronting the man he'd become, a spark of rebellion flickered in his chest. "No more," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Then louder. "No more." The words felt foreign on his tongue, like speaking a language he'd forgotten how to use. For years, Marcus had been the victim of his own story, the protagonist who never quite made it, the side character in everyone else's success story. He'd mastered the art of self-sabotage, turning every opportunity into an excuse for why things wouldn't work out. His apartment reflected his inner state, cluttered, neglected, filled with half-finished projects and broken promises to himself. Books on personal development gathered dust on his shelves, their spines mocking him with titles about success and transformation. He'd read them all, consumed every piece of advice, but never followed through. Knowledge without action had become his specialty. That day, something clicked. Perhaps it was seeing his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Chen, tending to her garden with such care and purpose despite her arthritis. Or maybe it was overhearing his roommate Jake on a work call, confidently presenting ideas and commanding respect. These people weren't superhuman. They simply showed up differently in their lives. Marcus realized he'd been waiting for motivation to strike like lightning, for confidence to arrive like a package delivered to his door. He'd been waiting for permission from the world to become the person he wanted to be. But as he stood in front of that mirror, he understood a fundamental truth. Transformation wasn't a destination, it was a daily choice. The first choice was simple, but revolutionary. Instead of scrolling through social media for the next hour, comparing his behind the scenes to everyone else's highlight reel, he would go for a walk, just 15 minutes around the block. Not because he felt like it, he definitely didn't, but because the person he wanted to become would make that choice. As he laced up his dusty running shoes, Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Possibility. Not the crushing weight of needing to change everything at once, but the gentle power of changing one small thing. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the door handle, his mind already generating excuses. It might rain. People might judge. Him? What was the point of just 15 minutes? But he opened the door anyway. The morning air hit his face like a slap of reality. The world was already in motion. People walking dogs, commuting to jobs, living their lives with purpose and direction. Marcus had been a spectator for too long. As he took his first step onto the sidewalk, he wasn't just beginning a walk, he was beginning the long journey back to himself. He didn't know it yet, but this single step would become the foundation of everything that followed. The mirror would tell a different story soon enough. 3 weeks after that first walk, Marcus discovered something remarkable. Momentum was real, and it was addictive. What started as a grudging 15-minute shuffle around the block had evolved into a morning ritual he actually looked forward to. The transformation wasn't dramatic. He hadn't suddenly become a marathon runner or lost 50 pounds, but something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with himself. The first week had been brutal. His inner critic worked overtime, filling his head with familiar refrains. "This is stupid. You'll quit by next week like you always do. One walk doesn't make you a different person." But Marcus had learned to recognize these thoughts as his old self trying to maintain the status quo. Instead of arguing with them, he simply acknowledged them and laced up his shoes anyway. By the second week, something unexpected happened. The voice grew quieter. Not because Marcus felt more confident. He didn't, not yet. But because he was building evidence against his own limiting beliefs. Each morning, he chose the walk over the snooze button. He was proving to himself that change was possible, one small decision at a time. The ripple effects surprised him. After his walks, Marcus found himself making his bed. Not because he'd read about the importance of small habits, but because he felt like someone who made his bed. The previous Marcus would have found this distinction laughable, but he was beginning to understand that identity wasn't fixed. It was fluid, changeable, and entirely within his control. His coworker Jenny noticed first. "You seem different lately," she said during a lunch break, studying his face with curious eyes. "More present, I guess?" Marcus almost deflected the compliment with self-deprecating humor, his usual defense mechanism. Instead, he paused and really considered her observation. He did feel more present. The morning walks had become a form of moving meditation, a time when his churning thoughts settled into something resembling clarity. The constant mental noise, the worry about the future, the regret about the past, the endless loop of self-criticism had begun to quiet. But the real breakthrough came during week 3, when Marcus faced his first major test. His ex-girlfriend Sarah called, her voice thick with tears, asking if they could meet for coffee. The old Marcus would have dropped everything, rearranging his schedule and his emotional state around her needs, desperate for any crumb of validation or possibility of reconciliation. Instead, he found himself saying, "I'm sorry you're going through a tough time, but I don't think meeting would be healthy for either of us right now." The words came from a place he didn't recognize in himself, not anger or bitterness, but genuine self-respect. After hanging up, Marcus sat in stunned silence. He'd just set a boundary, not perfectly, not without difficulty, but he'd done it. That evening, instead of ruminating about the call or questioning his decision, he did something unprecedented. He celebrated. Not with anything elaborate, just a moment of acknowledgement that he'd acted in alignment with the person he was becoming, rather than the person he'd always been. The celebration ritual became another cornerstone of his transformation. Marcus began keeping a small journal, not for deep philosophical reflections, but simply to record his daily wins. Chose salad over pizza. Spoke up in the team meeting. Didn't check phone for first hour after waking. These weren't earth-shattering achievements, but they were evidence of a new pattern emerging. His friend Jake noticed the journal one evening and laughed. "Dude, you're writing down that you made your bed? That's what my mom made me do when I was 8. Marcus felt the familiar heat of embarrassment rise in his cheeks, the old impulse to minimize his efforts or make jokes at his own expense. But something in him had changed. "Yeah," he said simply, "and it's working." Jake's laughter faded as he saw the quiet determination in Marcus's eyes. There was something different about his roommate, not arrogant or defensive, but solid, like he was standing on firmer ground than before. That night, Marcus looked in the mirror again. The face looking back wasn't dramatically different, still the same features, still the same basic appearance. But the eyes were different. There was life in them, a spark of possibility that hadn't been there before. More importantly, he no longer felt like he was looking at a stranger. The person in the mirror was becoming someone Marcus actually liked. 2 months into his transformation, Marcus encountered his first real setback, and it nearly broke him. The quarterly performance review he'd been preparing for went disastrously wrong. Despite weeks of preparation, despite his morning walks and his newfound habits, he froze during the presentation. His voice cracked, his hands shook, and he watched his supervisor's expression shift from hopeful to disappointed. Walking home that evening, Marcus felt the familiar weight of failure settling on his shoulders like an old, unwelcome friend. The voice of his inner critic, which had been growing quieter over the past weeks, roared back to life with renewed vengeance. See? Nothing's really changed. You're still the same pathetic loser you've always been. All this self-improvement nonsense was just a waste of time. For the first time since starting his morning walks, Marcus almost didn't go the next day. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling the gravitational pull of his old patterns. It would be so easy to slide back into the comfortable misery of his former life, to abandon this exhausting project of becoming better. But then he remembered something his neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had told him the previous week. He'd complimented her on her thriving garden, and she'd smiled with weathered wisdom. "The secret isn't never having bad days," she'd said, her accent thick, but her meaning clear. "The secret is what you do after the bad days." Marcus forced himself out of bed. Not because he felt motivated, motivation was nowhere to be found, but because he was beginning to understand that motivation was an unreliable friend. Discipline, however, was a loyal companion that showed up regardless of feelings. The walk, that morning, felt different. Instead of the usual sense of accomplishment, Marcus felt raw and vulnerable. But as his feet hit the pavement in their familiar rhythm, something shifted. The failure at work wasn't a verdict on his character. It was simply information. He'd identified an area where he needed to grow: public speaking and performance under pressure. This realization led to another small but significant decision. Instead of avoiding the discomfort, Marcus decided to lean into it. He researched local Toastmasters groups and, despite every fiber of his being screaming in protest, signed up for their next meeting. The first Toastmasters session was excruciating. Marcus's hands trembled as he introduced himself to the group, his voice barely audible above a whisper. But he stayed. He listened to others share their own struggles with public speaking, their own journeys from terror to confidence. He wasn't alone in this battle. Week after week, he returned. Not because it got easier, it didn't, not for a long time, but because he was learning something profound about the nature of courage. Courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was feeling the fear and showing up anyway. Every shaky introduction, every stumbling speech, every moment of wanting to flee but staying instead was building something invisible but indestructible inside him. The compound effect of these choices began to show up in unexpected places. At work, instead of shrinking from challenging projects, Marcus found himself volunteering for them. Not because he felt confident, confidence was still a work in progress, but because he was learning to trust in his ability to figure things out. His relationship with his family began to shift as well. During their weekly call, his mother mentioned how different he sounded. "More solid," was how she put it. "Like you're actually there when we talk, instead of somewhere else worrying about everything." The observation struck Marcus deeply because it was true. The constant mental chatter that had plagued him for years, the endless loop of worry, regret, and self-criticism, was finally beginning to quiet. Not because his life had become perfect, but because he was developing a different relationship with his thoughts and feelings. One evening, Marcus ran into his ex-girlfriend Sarah at the grocery store. She looked surprised to see him, and he realized with a start that he felt nothing. No surge of longing, no stab of pain, no desperate desire to impress her with how well he was doing. He felt genuinely neutral, which was perhaps the most profound change of all. "You look good," she said, and he could hear the puzzlement in her voice. "Different." "Thanks," Marcus replied simply. "I hope you're doing well." As he walked away, he caught his reflection in the store window. The man looking back at him stood straighter, moved with more purpose, carried himself like someone who had learned to respect himself. The transformation was becoming visible not just in his actions, but in his very presence. That night, writing in his journal, Marcus made a profound realization. He wasn't just changing his habits or his behaviors. He was changing his fundamental relationship with himself, and that was changing everything else. 4 months into his journey, Marcus faced a test that would determine whether his transformation was real or merely surface level. His company announced massive layoffs, and despite his recent improvements, his position was eliminated. The old Marcus would have spiraled into despair, seeing the layoff as confirmation of his worthlessness. But this Marcus, the one who had been forged through countless small choices, responded differently. The day he received the news, Marcus felt the familiar surge of panic and self-doubt. His first instinct was to catastrophize, to imagine himself homeless and destitute, to prove to himself that his recent growth had been an illusion. But then something remarkable happened. He caught himself in the middle of this mental spiral and made a conscious choice to step off the carousel of negative thinking. Instead of going home to sulk, Marcus went for his usual morning walk, even though it was nearly noon. As his feet found their rhythm on the familiar path, his mind began to clear. Yes, losing his job was frightening and uncertain, but it wasn't a death sentence, and it certainly wasn't a reflection of his worth as a human being. It was simply a challenge to navigate. The old Marcus had always waited for external circumstances to improve before he could feel good about himself. The new Marcus was learning to maintain his sense of self-worth regardless of what was happening around him. This was perhaps the most crucial skill he'd developed, the ability to separate his identity from his circumstances. Over the next few days, as the reality of unemployment set in, Marcus discovered reserves of resilience he didn't know he possessed. Instead of frantically applying to every job posting he could find, he took a more strategic approach. He used the opportunity to reflect on what he truly wanted from his career, not just what he thought he should want. The daily walks became even more important during this period. They weren't just exercise anymore. They were his anchor, his way of maintaining stability when everything else felt uncertain. Rain or shine, stressed or calm, Marcus walked. The consistency itself became a source of strength. During one particularly difficult week, when the job search felt hopeless and his savings dwindled, Marcus's commitment wavered. He found himself sitting on his couch at 9 a.m., still in his pajamas, scrolling mindlessly through job boards with a growing sense of despair. The voice of his old self whispered seductively, "Why keep trying? Why maintain these habits when nothing is working?" But then Marcus remembered a conversation he'd had with a fellow member of his Toastmasters group, an older man named Robert who had lost his job at 55 and spent 2 years rebuilding his career. "The habits that matter most," Robert had said, "are the ones you maintain when maintaining them seems pointless." Marcus closed his laptop, got dressed, and went for his walk. Not because he wanted to, but because the person he was becoming was someone who honored his commitments to himself, especially when it was difficult. This single decision, to walk when he didn't feel like it, to maintain his standard when his world felt chaotic, became a turning point. The breakthrough came 3 weeks later, but not in the way Marcus expected. While networking at a professional meetup, he met Elena, a startup founder who was looking for someone with his exact skill set. But more importantly, she was impressed by something intangible about him: his presence, his way of listening, his quiet confidence. "You have this quality," she told him during their second conversation. "Like you know who you are. That's rarer than you might think, especially in people our age." Marcus almost laughed. 6 months ago, he'd been the least self-aware person. He knew. But Elena was right. Through all the small daily choices, all the moments of choosing growth over comfort, he had indeed discovered who he was. Or perhaps more accurately, he had created who he was. The job offer that followed was better than anything he'd lost. But more importantly, Marcus approached it from a completely different mindset. He wasn't desperate for validation or terrified of failure. He was simply a competent person bringing his skills to solve interesting problems. The shift in perspective made all the difference. On his first day at the new job, Marcus woke up naturally before his alarm, a small miracle that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He made his bed, went for his walk, and prepared for the day with calm anticipation rather than anxious dread. Looking in the mirror as he straightened his tie, Marcus saw a man he genuinely respected. Not because everything was perfect, it wasn't, but because he had proven to himself that he could be trusted to show up for his own life, regardless of circumstances. The transformation was no longer a project or an experiment. It had become simply who he was. 6 months after his first reluctant walk around the block, Marcus began to notice something extraordinary. His transformation was affecting everyone around him in ways he never expected. The changes in him had created ripples that extended far beyond his personal sphere, touching lives he didn't even realize he was influencing. It started with his roommate Jake, who had initially mocked Marcus's journal of daily wins. Jake had been watching his friend's steady evolution with growing curiosity and, if he was honest, a touch of envy. One morning, Jake surprised himself by asking if he could join Marcus on his walk. "I don't know what you're doing," Jake admitted, as they fell into step together. "But whatever it is, it's working. I've been in the same rut for 2 years, and watching you change is making me realize I don't have to stay stuck." Marcus felt a profound sense of responsibility in that moment. He wasn't just changing for himself anymore, he was inadvertently becoming an example of what was possible. The realization was both humbling and motivating. Their morning walks became a time of honest conversation. Jake opened up about his own struggles with self-doubt and his fear of taking risks. Marcus found himself naturally slipping into a mentoring role, sharing the hard-won insights from his own journey. But more than his words, it was his living example that spoke loudest. The ripple effect extended to his workplace as well. Elena, his new boss, had hired Marcus not just for his technical skills, but for the intangible qualities she'd sensed in him. As he settled into his role, these qualities began to influence the entire team dynamic. During meetings, instead of shrinking from conflict or difficult conversations, Marcus found himself naturally facilitating them, not aggressively or domineeringly, but with a calm presence that helped others feel heard and valued. His colleagues began seeking him out for advice, not because he had all the answers, but because he listened without judgment and asked thoughtful questions. "You have this way of making people feel like their best selves," his coworker Maria told him after a particularly challenging team meeting. "I used to hate these sessions, but somehow when you're here, they feel safer." Marcus was amazed by this feedback. The old Marcus had been so consumed with his own insecurities that he'd had little emotional energy left to truly support others. But as he'd grown more secure in himself, he'd naturally become more available to those around him. Perhaps the most unexpected transformation occurred in his relationship with his family. During their weekly calls, his mother began sharing things she'd never opened up about before. Her own struggles with confidence, her regrets about opportunities she'd been too afraid to pursue. "You inspire me," she told him one evening, her voice thick with emotion. "If you can change this much in 6 months, maybe it's not too late for me either." Marcus felt tears prick his eyes. His mother was 62 years old, and here she was, talking about personal growth and new possibilities. He realized that his transformation had given her permission to believe in her own capacity for change. The most profound ripple effect, however, came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen, his elderly neighbor, approached him one morning as he returned from his walk. She was carrying a small potted plant, a seedling of some kind. "This is for you," she said, pressing the pot into his hands. "You remind me of this plant. When I first planted it, it looked like it might not survive. But with daily care, consistent attention, it grew strong. Now it produces seeds for other plants." Marcus looked down at the small green shoots emerging from the soil, understanding the metaphor immediately. He had become someone who planted seeds in others, not through grand gestures or profound speeches, but simply by showing up as his authentic self day after day. That evening, as he watered his new plant and reflected on the day, Marcus realized something that took his breath away. 6 months ago, he'd started this journey from a place of deep dissatisfaction with himself. He'd wanted to change because he hated who he was. But somewhere along the way, the motivation had shifted completely. Now, he continued growing not from self-hatred, but from self-love. He took care of himself not because he was broken and needed fixing, but because he was valuable and deserving of care. The distinction was everything. His journal entry that night was simple but profound. "I no longer change because I hate who I am. I change because I love who I'm becoming." As Marcus prepared for bed, he caught his reflection in the bathroom mirror, the same mirror where this journey had begun. The face looking back at him was undeniably different, not just physically but energetically. There was a light in his eyes, a ease in his expression, a sense of coming home to himself that radiated outward. But more than that, he could see the future stretching ahead of him, full of possibility and purpose. He was no longer someone who happened to life. He was someone who lived life intentionally, someone who created rather than merely reacted. The transformation was complete, yet somehow, Marcus knew it was also just beginning. 1 year after that first reluctant step onto the sidewalk, Marcus stood before a mirror that had witnessed his complete metamorphosis. But this wasn't the bathroom mirror in his cramped apartment. It was the mirror in his new home office, in the house he'd just purchased with the confidence of a man who trusted himself to meet his obligations. The reflection showed a man who stood tall, not from arrogance, but from authentic self-respect. His eyes held the quiet strength of someone who had faced his deepest fears and emerged victorious. The transformation was so complete that sometimes Marcus had to remind himself that this confident, purposeful person was indeed him. The morning walk that had started as a desperate attempt to change something, anything, had evolved into the cornerstone of a life he'd designed intentionally. But the walk itself had transformed too. What began as a solitary journey had become something more meaningful. Twice a week, Marcus led a small group of people who, like his former self, were ready to transform their lives one step at a time. The group had formed organically. Jake had invited a coworker struggling with anxiety. Elena had mentioned a friend going through a difficult divorce. Mrs. Chen had suggested her grandson who was battling depression. Word spread quietly through the network of people whose lives Marcus had touched, creating a community of individuals committed to becoming their best selves. "The thing about transformation," Marcus told the group one crisp morning as they gathered in the park, "is that it's never really about the specific habit you choose. It's about proving to yourself that you can choose differently, that you have power over your own life." He watched as his words landed differently with each person. Sarah, not his ex-girlfriend, but a new Sarah who had joined the group after a career setback, nodded with recognition. David, a retired teacher rebuilding his sense of purpose, smiled with understanding. Each person was fighting their own battle, but they were no longer fighting alone. The professional transformation had been equally remarkable. Marcus had not only excelled in his role at Elena's startup, but had been promoted to lead a team of his own. His approach to leadership was unlike anything his company had seen before. He led by example rather than authority, created psychological safety rather than demanding compliance, and inspired growth rather than enforcing conformity. "You don't manage people," Elena observed during his annual review. "You help people manage themselves. It's like you see who they could become and hold space for them to get there." Marcus smiled at the feedback, recognizing the truth in it. His own transformation had taught him that people don't need to be fixed or controlled. They need to be believed in and supported while they do the work themselves. But perhaps the most profound change was in his relationship with difficulty itself. The old Marcus had seen challenges as evidence of his inadequacy, problems as proof that he wasn't cut out for success. The new Marcus understood that challenges were simply the price of admission to a meaningful life. When his startup faced a major crisis 6 months into his leadership role, a key investor pulled out, threatening the company's survival. Marcus found himself responding with a calm competence that surprised even him. Instead of panicking or catastrophizing, he convened his team, acknowledged the reality of their situation, and guided them through a methodical problem-solving process. "I keep waiting for you to freak out," one of his team members said during a particularly stressful week. "How are you so calm about all this?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I'm not calm because I know everything will work out," he replied. "I'm calm because I know that whatever happens, we'll figure out how to handle it, and if we can't, we'll learn something valuable in the process." The company survived the crisis, stronger and more resilient than before. But more importantly, Marcus had proven to himself that his transformation wasn't just surface deep, it had fundamentally changed how he related to uncertainty and adversity. As he reflected on the year's journey, Marcus realized that the most significant transformation wasn't in what he had gained, but in what he had released. He'd let go of the need for external validation, the fear of failure, the crushing weight of perfectionism. He'd released the story of himself as a victim of circumstances and embraced his role as the author of his own life. The evening of his 1-year anniversary, Marcus returned to that original bathroom mirror. He stood there for a long moment, not in self-criticism as he had a year ago, but in genuine appreciation. He thought about the scared, defeated man who had whispered no more to his reflection and felt a wave of compassion for that earlier version of himself. "Thank you," he said quietly to the man he used to be. "Thank you for being brave enough to take that first step." As he prepared for bed, Marcus felt a deep sense of completion. Not because his growth was finished. He knew now that personal development was a lifelong journey, but because he had successfully answered the most important question a person could ask. What am I capable of? The answer, he now knew, was anything he was willing to work for, one day at a time. His final journal entry of the year was simple but revolutionary. "I am no longer becoming the person I want to be. I am the person I want to be, continuing to grow." Marcus set down his pen, turned off the light, and prepared for sleep with the deep satisfaction of a man who had kept every promise he'd ever made to himself. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for growth, new chances to lead by example. But tonight, for the first time in his adult life, Marcus fell asleep not worrying about the future or regretting the past, but resting in the profound peace of knowing exactly who he was and trusting completely in his ability to handle whatever came next. The transformation was complete. The journey was just beginning.